And so I'm going to be certainly so I should not move this way. So I'll certainly be within the 20 minutes so that we can have more Q&A and perhaps less effect of our food on our bodies. Okay, so this is some work that I'm doing along with my doctoral student, Neeraj Mankar. And we presented an earlier version of this, and I promised Vibodh that a more fine-tuned version is going to be given to him, and we're working on it. Actually, as we speak, Neeraj is also talking to a few more people in the corporate world in terms of the entertainment industry and trying to examine issues of digital competency. So the question that we were trying to address is, if you look at the entertainment industry and if you look at the issues of digitization, what kinds of competencies are firms acquiring or ought to be acquiring perhaps to be able to make that transition, which is, you want to call it more efficient, more effective, right? So what are those competencies? It's part of what one would call the strategy literature within management. I'm at the School of Management in IIT Bombay. Yes, IIT Bombay has a School of Management. All the old IITs have schools of management, as well as design schools and many other schools. So let me move ahead. Okay. So in terms of strategy, one important marker for the paper is a shift from resource-based, and I'll talk about it a little later, to dynamic capability. So what are the capabilities that firms are acquiring? And when I say dynamic capabilities, basically in terms of network capabilities, in terms of being able to create a certain competency of digitization, all of this will sort of be elaborated upon. And the three competencies, which again I will elaborate subsequently, that we have narrowed down to are, what are the content, how are firms able to mutate content, and the thinking about that has to start very early on. What forms of firm readiness that exist, and network creation, right? So as firms digitize, we see these challenges becoming very critical. Just to provide a bit of a backdrop, there are certain clearly constraints of what one would call, and this is now literature which almost everybody is acquainted with. The constraints of the brick and mortar model are quite clear, and I'm not going to sort of enumerate all of them. There's something called the victim of popularity, right? A paradoxical way of putting it, in the sense that, if in the typical bookstore, if you will, or music store, if you visit the store, you have what are perhaps the most popular in the sense most sold books that are on the shelf. But if you look at it much more closely, the shelf life has an economic cost to it, right? So what are you putting on the shelf has a certain cost in the sense that in the most popular version, and that also creates a certain economic constraints for certain these bookstores or music stores, if you will. So the economics of digitization has certainly rendered these issues much more difficult for the physical bookstores. So when I say the constraints of the brick and mortar model, what is happening is that not just popular books, but so-called relatively unpopular stuff, in the sense that they're not sold as high in terms of volume, but they can also be easily procured, right? We just think about Flipkart or Amazon, etc. Right? So it's not good to be a victim of a particular kind of popularity, right? There are also issues of broadcast technologies. That cable has clearly a limited reach for large audiences, as they need to be aggregated in defined geographic areas, right? Which is again a constraint which is considerably being overcome by, say, through the net or other mechanisms, right? So dispersed audiences, the flip side of that, the dispersed audiences can be aggregated more easily, right? And you have something called the long tail, which allows you to accrue advantages, right? So in some ways, to frame these questions, I'm borrowing from Henry Chesbrough, and basically what he's saying is that one typical way, very simplified way of looking at a business model is in terms of revenue and cost generation, right? Revenue generation and the expenditure. Right? So there's always an increase in the cost, right? Internal development costs are always sort of increasing. And in the typical quote-unquote closed business models, the conventional models, the market revenues would also begin to curtail because you'd have newer products that are coming in, right? The shorter shelf life, newer products, so you're always competing with the next product that is coming on the horizon. So he also begins to talk about relatively opening up these business models. Right? So what is happening is that firms can take advantage of newer sources of income, which could be licensing or other mechanisms. Right? So revenues could be going up, as well as the fact that you are beginning to also leverage external development. Right? And this, although seeming in 2015, seemingly sort of commonsensical, is not easy to sort of understand if you think in terms of large business houses and how they think about research or even development, right? To be able to admit that there's more talent outside the firm than inside it is a concession that has taken considerable time. One brief sort of example that I mentioned here is one of Procter & Gamble, which started something called Connect and Develop. It was a portal which allowed for prize to be given for solving large, chemistry kinds of related issues, right? So they are consumer goods industry, obviously. They're part of the consumer goods industry, and they would offer prizes for, say, how do you put in paste within a tube, right? How do you do that actually, right? So if you were to solve some of these puzzles, which were basically useful for Procter & Gamble to address its own internal R&D needs, you'd get a certain prize for it. But the point I'm trying to make is that it was very difficult for Procter & Gamble to create an R&D setup which sort of told the previous head, the manager of R&D, saying that you do not have enough talent inside to be able to solve this problem. So they actually had to set up an entire new R&D setup. Right? So leveraging talent from outside, or leveraging unused internal technologies, for instance, we know for a fact that many large companies or some smaller companies, particularly most in the Western context, have, because of the liberalness with which you can get patents, they have several, patents which are lying but unused. Right? And if you want to look at it from a pure management perspective or revenue generating perspective, right, a patent which is lying on your shelf, is it a cost or is it a potential revenue? Right? It is potential revenue, but there's a yearly cost borne, that you have to, pay to the government for making or keeping the patent alive, right, year-on-year basis. So how does a firm which is relatively locked into an older regime of high internal costs, so increasing internal costs, how does it leverage the development from outside, getting talent, and how do you also create new sources of income? So closed models, one way of putting it, have innovation inefficiencies. Right? Markets do not efficiently respond all the time. Right? There's disruption, there's many forms of innovation, the price-performance ratios are not as good. Right? And so there's considerable literature on this, which I'm not going to get into right now. So the context is fairly clear, one doesn't have to belabor the point. Right? Smartphones, film prints, increasing digital film prints, right? Transition towards digital cable TV, music sales, although one of our common friends, Greg Booth, would say that nobody knows who's making money in the music industry in India. But digitization is nevertheless happening. Okay? So we see the evolution of, quote-unquote, the dynamic consumer. The needs are increasing. There is a favorable regulation, at least an attempt to allow for these transitions to happen from the analog to digital, and there is the entry of global competition. So all in all, we have an industry which is churning. Okay? just a quick snapshot of the music industry, and the scales on the y-axis is going to shift. So, basically, what you see is public performance has a certain graph, or but if you put in radio sales through physical format and finally digital, what you see is clearly that the digital sales are disproportionately higher. Okay. And Saregama is another firm that we looked into. What you see is that the digital part, the revenues that is accruing through, so what you see is that the licensing is coming very proximate to the amount of revenues that they are getting from their overall ability to accrue revenues. Okay. So basically, what does it lead to? That issues of production and distribution challenge. That's one way of looking at it. But more fundamentally, there is this, we're calling it a strategic challenge, right? And there's a transition from a resource-based model to what one in the literature is being called a dynamic capabilities model. A resource-based model is basically much more traditional in the sense you look at internal sources that you have and how do you tap into that. Right? While the dynamic capabilities model is trying, as I said earlier, to be able to look at talent from outside, look at sources of income that you can generate. So there is, the word dynamic in that way suggests the nature of the model. Right? So the conceptual underpinnings are that achieving and sustaining of competitive advantage is central question, yes. That the firm's value, both in terms of market share and in premium, is the basis of sustained competitive advantage. And competencies can be built out of these capabilities. Okay. So this is the kind of framework that we think which may be helpful in understanding the transition. Right. There is the external environment which is rapidly changing. Right. Particular moments it changes much more rapidly. Watershed moments. Right. And firms need to acquire certain competencies. Okay. So what you mostly do is your firm processes and routines that you have. Right. You need to build upon them. The building of those routines building on top of those processes and routines, you create the capabilities, and basically to achieve value, which leads to competitive advantage. Right? Fairly straightforward. So these are the three. Coming back to what I said earlier, these are the three competencies that we thought were, in Neeraj's work and sort of, my engagement with him, we've sort of been able to narrow down on these three. So let me go through them a little more with some elaboration. So content mutability is basically the ability to mutate content to suit the idiosyncrasies of the medium of consumption. Now what would that mean, if you were to break it up, right? So increasingly digital content is seen on smaller devices, right? Sort of your smartphone, the size of that is limited as opposed to large screens. So if you want to think of the user or the viewer in that context, you have to begin to anticipate what would be a user looking for, in terms of a small screen. So one quick example to suggest is usually in terms of large screens or films, etc., you have these long shots, right? And particularly some directors love those long shots, right? So which doesn't lend itself to a small screen because you can get completely lost. You need to have characters always doing something on smaller screens, right? So if you were to really think of digitization, it's not merely rendering an analog into digital thing, but you also need to be thinking about how you write your script, how you direct your films, So it's really coming back to value creation at very fundamental levels. That's just one example. Right? So rethinking your script, rethinking the direction of it, That's what we mean when we say, for instance, content has to be mutable. There's also the question of, form readiness. Somebody was sharing this with me that India is one of those rarer geographies where Google had to bring in several engineers because the number of devices that are there in India proliferate, and it was very difficult for them to really figure out how to be able to search with Google on all these devices. So form readiness is an ability to utilize information communication technology to encase the content in multiple configurations, which perhaps seems fairly straightforward, but you need to be able to have, for a YouTube version, a particular way of rendering the encasing, which will be different depending on so there's a challenge, device-wise challenge, and that's what we mean when I say form readiness. The files and the kind of physical devices on which it is going to be seen. The third is what we've stated here is network creation, which is basically the ability to forge network ties with other firms across the value chain, right, to better leverage. So content which in one way is Airtel is said to be the largest music firm in India. Right. The revenues that Airtel makes from music is higher than, say, a T-Series. So if you begin to look at music from the perspective of revenue generation and not just content creation, then it begins to flip our understanding of what is the music industry. So an Airtel has what one would call in this context good network creation, right? Its ability to forge networks, right, to be able to leverage on the content that is available, right? So not just Airtel, but even other films, right, film production enterprises require considerable amount of collaboration to be able to finally produce the film or content that you want. So these three are ones that we have sort of narrowed down to, which I think are, or we think are critical for digitization. Right? If you were to look at each one of these individually, in terms of the Hindi general entertainment channel, so as I said earlier, to be able to make episodes of lesser duration, apparently for some reason on a television screen you do not mind sitting through a 22-minute serial, right, with all the breaks, but on a smartphone device or something you want it in 10 minutes. Right? So it's something called a quickie-sode. So Sony basically creates these multiple duration clicks of the same content, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, so depending on whether you want, maybe I'm just making it up here, but if you want more music in the content or more drama, there is a different versions of the content being made available to you. Right? So it requires the alter to length of content, and I don't think it's a simple question of just chipping or sort of fragmenting the larger piece, right? So you need to be able to do that with some skill, a prior. Right? In terms of form readiness, Sony Live again that we looked at, giving consumers a choice in viewing the content on the device of the. So Sony Live, what it does is on the evening of the day when a serial is sort of telecast. How many times? Okay, 2-3 minutes. All right. So Sony basically puts the content on its internet site, right? So basically you have, and we did another study, small study, where the number of people actually visiting the site is coming close to those who actually see it on television. So there is considerable correlation between those who are actually seeing it on this on the television screens as well as those who are looking at it on the internet. Right? And finally, network creation, right? Tie-ups with mobile operators, video sharing sites, and syndicating of content, right? let me go a little more quickly here. So if you see comparison between T-Series and Saregama, right? What you see is that in some ways there are many other differences that you can suggest between the two. But what T-Series does is that because of its, and we are making that argument, because of its ability to digitize content more quickly, it has basically been able to, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but that lends itself to higher revenues. Right? So there is a relation between the digitization of music content and its increasing revenues. Right? So at the bottom you'll see market share for Saregama is about 20% of the, and T-Series has gone much higher. Okay. So to sort of conclude, I would say that there is a moment of transition in the entertainment industry with firms, and what they're looking out for is what part of the value chain can you leverage, right, more effectively. And leveraging external development is something that was anathema before, but it's certainly now very common, right? So there is a relative opening, if you will, of business model. That doesn't mean that you're, as the discussions have happened in the morning, that they're not opening their account books as yet, right? But they are certainly opening up ways to be able to generate better content, right? So just let me leave it at that. Thank you.